The siege of Tenochtitlan enters its 75th day under a blood-orange dawn that stains the waters of Lake Texcoco the color of old copper. From the Spanish encampments scattered along the causeways like infected wounds, the great island city appears to shimmer in the morning haze, its stepped pyramids and whitewashed palaces rising from the lake like the fever dream of a dying conquistador. Captain General Hernán Cortés commands approximately 900 Spanish soldiers distributed across 4 siege camps, their ranks bolstered by an estimated 200,000 indigenous allies drawn from the Tlaxcalan Confederation and other subjugated city-states. The mathematical precision of European warfare meets the vast human tide of Mesoamerican politics in a collision that will reshape 2 continents. The lake itself becomes the siege's defining geography. Tenochtitlan sits connected to the mainland by 3 primary causeways: Tepeyac to the north, Tacuba to the west, and Iztapalapan to the south. Each causeway stretches between 2 and 4 kilometers across the shallow, alkaline waters, their raised surfaces barely wide enough for 8 men to walk abreast. Cortés has learned, through 75 days of blood and mathematics, that controlling these arteries means controlling the city's breath. Pedro de Alvarado holds the Tacuba Causeway with 180 conquistadors and approximately 60,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. His encampment bristles with crossbows, harquebuses, and 4 bronze falconets that speak their iron language across the water at irregular intervals. Cristobal de Olid commands the Coyoacan position to the south with similar numbers, while Gonzalo de Sandoval maintains the northern siege line at Tepeyac with 150 Spaniards and the largest contingent of allied warriors. The technology gap appears decisive on parchment. Spanish steel meets obsidian and hardened wood. Gunpowder confronts atlatl and sling. Horses, still mythological creatures to most defenders, charge against warriors who have never seen quadrupeds larger than dogs. Yet Tenochtitlan's defenders, led by the young Huey Tlatoani Cuauhtémoc, have transformed their island fortress into a maze of sharpened stakes, flooded streets, and improvised battlements that channel Spanish tactical advantages into narrow killing grounds. The city's population, estimated by Spanish scribes at between 200,000 and 300,000 souls, has been decimated by smallpox, typhus, and the systematic destruction of the aqueduct system that once carried fresh water from Chapultepec Hill. Bodies float in the canals between residential districts, creating a putrid geography that offends European sensibilities while serving Aztec defensive strategy. The dead become obstacles, the dying become desperate fighters with nothing left to preserve except the manner of their ending. Local folklore, whispered among Spanish camp followers and indigenous auxiliaries alike, speaks of something stirring in the deepest canals as the siege stretches into its 3rd month. The Mexica have always understood their lake as more than water. It connects the visible world to Mictlan, the realm of bones, through underground currents that flow beyond the reach of Spanish theology. Temple priests, working in flooded basement chambers of the Templo Mayor, conduct ceremonies that predate Christian conquest by centuries. Tlaxcalan warriors, despite their alliance with Cortés, maintain careful ritual behaviors around the lake's edge after sunset. They avoid drinking directly from certain sections of water, particularly near the southern causeway, where Spanish engineers have noted unusual temperature variations in their daily measurements. The water runs cold even under the afternoon sun, creating thermal layers that their instruments cannot adequately explain. Spanish chaplains dismiss such concerns as pagan superstition, yet their own evening prayers have grown longer since the siege entered May. Father Juan Diaz, attached to Alvarado's command, records in his private journal that the sounds emanating from Tenochtitlan after midnight suggest something beyond conventional warfare, rhythmic percussion that seems to originate from beneath the city rather than within its visible structures. The mathematical certainty of European siegecraft meets the fluid mathematics of lake, legend, and a civilization that understands warfare as spiritual practice. As the 75th dawn breaks over Tenochtitlan, the Spanish commanders calculate angles of approach, powder supplies, and casualty ratios with the precision of men who have conquered empires. They do not yet calculate what might be calculating them. Cristobal de Olid receives Cortés' written orders by torchlight in his command tent, the parchment still bearing the Captain General's red wax seal impressed with the arms of Extremadura. The mission parameters are precise in their ambition and deliberately vague in their tactical implementation, a reconnaissance in force designed to probe the southern canal network of Tenochtitlan while disrupting what Spanish intelligence believes to be a critical supply route feeding the city's dwindling defenders. The assault force assembles in the pre-dawn gloom consists of 42 Spanish infantry under the command of Captain Diego López de Ayala, a veteran of the Italian campaigns who carries scars from Ravenna on his sword arm and maintains the methodical precision of a man who has calculated the mathematics of survival across multiple continental wars. His soldiers carry the standard loadout of conquistador warfare: steel helmets and breastplates over quilted cotton armor, Toledo steel swords measuring 90 centimeters from crossguard to point, triangular daggers for close work, and 24 crossbows with approximately 600 iron-tipped bolts distributed among the ranks. Supporting López de Ayala's infantry are 12 harquebusiers equipped with matchlock firearms of varying Portuguese and Flemish manufacture. These weapons represent the technological edge of European warfare: iron tubes bound with leather and brass, capable of hurling lead balls through steel plate at ranges exceeding 100 paces, though their rate of fire remains limited to one shot every 2 minutes under optimal conditions. Each harquebusier carries a powder horn containing 2 pounds of black powder, a leather pouch of lead balls, lengths of slow match soaked in saltpeter solution, and iron ramrods for loading their temperamental weapons. The naval component of the mission consists of 2 brigantines, shallow draft vessels constructed from salvaged timber and bronze fittings, each measuring 12 meters from bow to stern with a beam of 3 meters amidships. These craft, christened Santa Maria and Santiago by their Spanish crews, mount small falconet cannons capable of firing 2-pound iron shot at close range. Their crews consist of 8 Spanish sailors and 4 indigenous paddlers per vessel, men who have learned to navigate the treacherous shallows and hidden stakes that guard Tenochtitlan's approaches through 75 days of trial, error, and accumulated casualties. The supporting indigenous force numbers approximately 800 warriors drawn primarily from Texcoco and Chalco city-states, recent converts to the Spanish cause who bring intimate knowledge of local geography and generations of accumulated grievances against Aztec tributary demands. These allies carry traditional weapons, obsidian-edged clubs called macuahuitl, atlatl spear throwers, with fire-hardened darts, slings loaded with stones selected for weight and aerodynamic properties, and cotton armor quilted with salt for additional protective value. López de Ayala studies the mission objectives by flickering candlelight in Olid's tent while the lake whispers against the shoreline outside. The primary target is a complex of residential islands connected by narrow bridges approximately 2 kilometers southeast of the Templo Mayor, identified by Spanish observers as a staging area for Aztec night raids against the southern causeway. Intelligence suggests that Mexico warriors use these floating gardens and canal networks to launch surprise attacks under cover of darkness, emerging from the maze of waterways like phantoms to strike Spanish positions before melting back into the lake's embrace. The tactical plan appears straightforward in its conception. The brigantines will transport the Spanish infantry and selected indigenous allies directly across the lake under cover of pre-dawn darkness, approaching the target islands from the east, where Aztec observation posts are presumed to be weakest. López de Ayala will establish a beachhead on the largest island, while his arquebusiers provide covering fire from the boats. Indigenous allies will secure the connecting bridges and prevent enemy withdrawal, while Spanish infantry conducts systematic clearance operations through the residential districts. The mission timeline allows for 4 hours of operational activity before full daylight exposes the assault force to concentrated defensive fire from Tenochtitlan's main fortifications. Extraction will occur via the same brigantines, with Spanish forces withdrawing to predetermined rally points along the southern shoreline, where OLID maintains reserve forces capable of providing artillery support if the withdrawal encounters organized resistance. Yet the mission briefing contains subtle acknowledgments of factors that resist conventional military planning. López de Ayala's written orders include specific warnings about engaging enemy forces near certain canal intersections, particularly those marked by stone carvings that predate the current political arrangement between city-states. Spanish chaplains have blessed the expedition's weapons and ammunition with particular attention to iron-tipped projectiles, applying holy water and sacred oils according to procedures typically reserved for campaigns against Moorish adversaries rather than indigenous populations. Tlaxcalan advisors attached to the mission express concerns about conducting operations during the dark of the moon, citing seasonal patterns of enemy activity that align with ceremonial calendars rather than conventional military logic. They speak of increased defensive preparations around temple complexes during periods of lunar darkness, referring to ritual obligations that require certain warrior societies to maintain vigilance against threats that exist beyond the visible spectrum of conflict. As the eastern horizon begins to pale with the approach of dawn, López de Ayala's assault force completes final preparations for an operation designed to probe the outer defenses of a civilization that has never distinguished between the physical and spiritual dimensions of warfare. The Spanish commander checks his timepiece, a mechanical marvel acquired in Seville, and notes the precise moment when his calculated advance into the unknown will commence. He does not yet understand that time itself operates differently in the waters they are about to enter. The brigantines cut through water that feels thicker than it should, their shallow hulls creating wakes that seem to linger longer than physics would suggest before dissolving into the lake's dark surface. Captain López de Ayala stands in the bow of the Santa Maria, one hand gripping the bronze rail while his eyes scan the approaching shoreline of what Spanish maps identify as the Xochimilco district, a maze of artificial islands and floating gardens that extend Tenochtitlan's agricultural capacity into the lake itself. The silence disturbs him more than enemy contact would. 75 days of siege warfare have trained Spanish ears to interpret the acoustic signatures of Aztec defensive preparation, the scrape of obsidian against grinding stones, the rhythmic chanting that accompanies weapon consecration rituals, the splash of canoes moving supplies through canal networks. This morning offers none of those familiar sounds. The lake absorbs noise with an unnatural efficiency that makes the Spanish soldiers whisper despite tactical doctrine that emphasizes voice discipline through training rather than superstition. Master Gunner Rodrigo Vasquez, crouched beside the Santa Maria's falconet, reports temperature readings that contradict his instruments. The bronze cannon barrel, exposed to pre-dawn air that should measure approximately 8 degrees Celsius, according to seasonal norms, remains warm to the touch as though recently fired. His powder charges, stored in leather containers designed to prevent moisture absorption, show signs of crystallization that typically occurs during winter storage rather than Springfield operations. Vasquez has served in artillery units from Naples to the Netherlands, and his experience suggests environmental conditions that exist outside European meteorological understanding. The indigenous paddlers maintain steady rhythm despite growing agitation that manifests through subtle changes in their stroke patterns. Texcoco warriors, normally vocal in their encouragement of Spanish tactical initiatives, paddle in complete silence while their eyes track movements in the water that Spanish observers cannot detect. Several Allied fighters touch carved amulets hanging from leather cords around their necks, protective talismans that depict stylized serpents with feathered crests, symbols that predate their recent conversion to Christian theology by several centuries. López de Ayala's tactical assessment encounters factors that resist conventional military analysis. The residential islands ahead appear correctly positioned according to Spanish reconnaissance maps prepared over weeks of observation, yet their visual proportions seem to shift as the brigantines approach. Distances that should measure approximately 500 meters between major landmasses compress and expand in ways that challenge depth perception trained through years of European siege warfare. Stone buildings that appeared single-story from Spanish observation posts now reveal multiple levels carved below the waterline, their submerged chambers glowing with light sources that cannot be identified from surface approaches. The water itself presents anomalies that Spanish naval experience cannot categorize. Lake Texcoco, despite its shallow average depth of 2 meters, shows thermal layering typically associated with deep ocean environments. Temperature measurements taken by trailing copper instruments indicate warm surface currents flowing above significantly colder, deeper water, creating convection patterns that should not exist in such a confined freshwater system. The salinity content, measured through taste testing by experienced sailors, varies dramatically across small distances in ways that suggest underground connections to distant water sources. More troubling are the organic indicators floating just beneath the surface tension. Spanish soldiers, trained to identify enemy movement through peripheral vision techniques learned in Italian campaign warfare, report glimpses of large forms moving parallel to the brigantines at depths that should prevent visual detection. These shapes maintain consistent distance from the boats while exhibiting movement patterns too regular to represent normal aquatic life and too large to fit known classifications of lake fauna. Father Mercado, the expedition chaplain assigned to provide spiritual support for the mission, conducts a blessing ceremony that encounters unexpected resistance. His vial of holy water, consecrated according to precise Vatican protocols at the cathedral in Cuba, refuses to mix properly with lake water when sprinkled over the boat's bow rails. The blessed liquid forms discrete spheres that maintain their integrity for several minutes before dissolving, creating temporary rainbow patterns in the surface tension that suggest optical properties inconsistent with normal water chemistry. The Tlaxcalan warriors assigned as scouts for the expedition begin displaying behaviors that concern Spanish tactical observers. These Allied fighters, normally eager to demonstrate their value through aggressive reconnaissance activities, now refuse to enter certain sections of water despite direct orders from their indigenous commanders. They speak in hushed tones about seasonal changes in the lake's spiritual geography, referring to annual cycles when boundaries between the visible world and deeper realms become permeable according to calendrical calculations that Spanish scholars have not yet learned to interpret. Archaeological evidence visible along the shoreline suggests continuous habitation extending back several centuries before Spanish arrival, yet the construction techniques display sophistication that challenges European assumptions about indigenous technological development. Stone cutting demonstrates precision that requires tools harder than available local materials, while architectural alignments correspond to astronomical phenomena with accuracy that implies mathematical knowledge surpassing contemporary European educational standards. As the brigantines close to within 300 meters of their intended landing sites, López de Ayala notices that his compass needle no longer points toward magnetic north, with its customary reliability. The instrument, crafted by Portuguese artisans and tested across Atlantic navigation routes, now oscillates between multiple directional readings while the sun, visible on the eastern horizon, appears to occupy a position several degrees off its expected azimuth for this time of day and season. The Spanish commander checks his mechanical timepiece against the visual evidence of dawn progression and discovers a discrepancy that suggests either instrument failure or temporal distortion. According to his calculations, the mission timeline allows 37 minutes for the approach phase before commencing landing operations. Yet the sun's position indicates that significantly more time has elapsed since departure from the Coyoacán base camp. López de Ayala signals the Santiago to maintain formation while preparing his soldiers for contact with an enemy that appears to understand warfare as something more complex than the tactical exchanges between competing civilizations. As the residential districts of Tenochtitlan resolve into increasing detail through the morning mist, Spanish steel encounters the first intimations of a conflict that will challenge every assumption about the nature of reality itself. The first Aztec warrior emerges from the canal water without creating ripples, his movement so fluid that Spanish sentries initially mistake him for floating debris until obsidian-edged weapons catch the early light. López de Ayala's tactical training, honed through campaigns where enemy contact followed predictable patterns of approach and engagement, encounters a form of warfare that operates according to principles outside European military doctrine. The warrior stands waist-deep in water that should be chest-high according to Spanish depth measurements, his cotton armor unmarked by moisture despite obvious submersion. His macuahuitl, the traditional Aztec war club embedded with volcanic glass, reflects sunlight from surfaces that appear wet yet show no evidence of water droplets. When he calls out in Nahuatl, his voice carries across the lake with acoustic properties that suggest amplification through underwater chambers rather than simple vocal projection. Master Gunner Vasquez attempts to bring the Santa Maria's falconet to bear on this first confirmed enemy contact, but discovers that his bronze cannon refuses to traverse properly on its wooden carriage. The weapon, mechanically sound according to daily maintenance protocols, now exhibits resistance to movement that feels like the metal itself has developed preferences about target selection. Vasquez applies leverage techniques learned through years of artillery service, yet the cannon barrel remains fixed on a bearing that points toward empty water rather than the visible threat. Additional Aztec defenders materialize along the shoreline with timing that suggests coordinated emergence rather than response to Spanish approach. These warriors appear at intervals that correspond to no tactical spacing doctrine known to European military science. Their positions create geometric patterns that serve defensive purposes, while simultaneously forming symbolic arrangements recognizable to indigenous allied forces as representations of ceremonial significance. The Tlaxcalan paddlers assigned to López de Ayala's expedition begin exhibiting behaviors that transcend normal battlefield stress responses. Several warriors drop their paddles entirely and begin chanting in low voices, their words following rhythmic patterns that predate their recent alliance with Spanish forces. When López de Ayala demands explanation through Nahuatl translators attached to the expedition, the responses reference seasonal obligations to spiritual entities that require acknowledgement before military action can proceed. Sergeant Domingo Flores, a veteran of Italian siege warfare with documented experience in urban combat operations, reports visual anomalies that challenge his professional assessment capabilities. Aztec defenders visible along the residential district shoreline appear to cast shadows that do not correspond to the sun's actual position, creating multiple directional patterns that suggest illumination from light sources that Spanish observers cannot locate. These shadow distortions create confusion in range estimation techniques that Flores has relied upon throughout his military career. The water surrounding both brigantines begins displaying phenomena that contradict fundamental assumptions about liquid behavior under normal atmospheric conditions. Surface tension patterns form and dissolve in geometric configurations that resemble carved stone motifs visible on Tenochtitlán's temple architecture, yet these formations appear spontaneously without wind or current explanations. Temperature variations, measured by trailing copper instruments, now show readings that fluctuate between extreme heat and near-freezing conditions across distances measured in arm's lengths, rather than the gradual thermal transitions expected in natural water bodies. López de Ayala orders his arquebusiers to prepare firing positions while maintaining visual contact with enemy forces that refuse to behave according to conventional tactical patterns. Aztec warriors along the shoreline neither advance toward Spanish positions nor retreat to prepared defensive positions, instead maintaining stationary formations that suggest they are waiting for developments that exist outside Spanish operational planning. Their discipline appears absolute, yet their stillness creates psychological pressure on Spanish forces trained to interpret enemy behavior through movement patterns and positioning changes. The indigenous allies aboard both brigantines display increasing agitation that manifests through physical symptoms resembling religious ecstasy rather than combat stress. Texcoco warriors begin speaking in voices that sound different from their normal vocal patterns, using intonations that their Spanish commanders have never heard despite months of close cooperation. Several Allied fighters request permission to enter the water, claiming obligations to spiritual protocols that supersede their military service agreements with Spanish forces. Father Mercado attempts to conduct battlefield prayers designed to provide spiritual support for Catholic soldiers engaging pagan adversaries, but discovers that his liturgical training encounters resistance from environmental factors that appear to actively interfere with Christian ceremonial practices. His prayer book, bound in leather and printed in Salamanca according to ecclesiastical specifications, shows text that seems to shift and blur when opened to pages containing exorcism rituals specifically selected for campaigns against indigenous populations practicing pre-Christian religious customs. Acoustic phenomena begin affecting Spanish tactical communications in ways that suggest deliberate interference rather than natural sound distortion. Orders shouted between the Santa Maria and Santiago require multiple repetitions before achieving comprehension, while Aztec vocalizations carry with perfect clarity across distances that should render speech unintelligible. The lake itself appears to function as a selective amplification system that favors indigenous communication while degrading Spanish coordination efforts. López de Ayala's timepiece, consulted to maintain operational scheduling, now displays readings that contradict all external evidence of temporal progression. According to the mechanical instrument, only 12 minutes have elapsed since initial enemy contact, yet the sun's position indicates advancement consistent with at least 2 hours of daylight progression. This temporal discrepancy suggests either complete instrument failure or environmental conditions that affect the fundamental nature of time measurement within the operational area. The Spanish commander signals his forces to prepare for landing operations while observing Aztec defensive preparations that follow no recognizable military logic. Enemy warriors begin moving in coordinated patterns that create symbolic formations visible from elevated Spanish positions, their tactical arrangements serving both defensive functions and ceremonial purposes that Spanish military doctrine has no framework for interpreting. As the brigantines approach within 50 meters of the intended landing sites, López de Ayala realizes that his expedition has encountered not merely a different military tradition, but a form of warfare that operates according to principles that challenge European understanding of the fundamental nature of conflict itself. The waters of Lake Texcoco begin to glow with phosphorescent light that emanates from depths that Spanish instruments had measured as impossible. Something vast moves beneath the surface, creating pressure waves that lift both brigantines simultaneously while generating no visible disturbance in the surrounding water. the lake erupts. Not in the explosive fashion that Spanish military experience would recognize. No geyser of displaced water, no foam and spray marking the emergence of a massive form. Instead, Lake Texcoco simply parts, creating a circular void approximately 30 meters in diameter that exposes lakebed that should not exist at these coordinates. The revealed bottom shows carved stone channels, forming intricate patterns that extend downward beyond the reach of morning sunlight, architectural precision that predates any known construction in the Valley of Mexico. From this impossible opening rises what López de Ayala's tactical mind initially attempts to categorize as an enemy war engine, some form of siege apparatus constructed by Aztec engineers to counter Spanish naval operations. The emerging form displays structural elements consistent with military engineering: protective plating, articulated sections designed for mobility, weapon systems capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Yet the materials and construction methods transcend any technology known to either European or indigenous military traditions. The creature's scales reflect light with the intensity of polished bronze while displaying the flexibility of living tissue. Each individual plate measures approximately 1 meter square, their surfaces etched with geometric patterns that match the architectural motifs visible throughout Tenochtitlan's temple complexes. The overall form suggests serpentine anatomy extended to proportions that challenge visual comprehension, length that continues emerging from the lakebed long after Spanish observers cease attempting accurate measurement. Master Gunner Vázquez achieves target acquisition with his falconet, despite the weapon's earlier mechanical resistance, but discovers that his bronze cannon now fires without requiring ignition of the powder charge. The 2-pound iron shot leaves the barrel with tremendous velocity, while generating no muzzle flash, no smoke, no acoustic signature that would indicate normal gunpowder combustion. The projectile strikes the creature's forward section and produces no visible damage, instead creating resonant tones that carry across the lake like temple bells announcing ceremonial obligations. The entity's head, when it fully emerges above the waterline, displays features that blend reptilian anatomy with architectural elements drawn from Aztec religious sculpture. Eyes the size of Spanish shields reflect intelligence that Spanish military doctrine has no framework for engaging, not the simple cunning of battlefield adversaries, but awareness that encompasses strategic thinking on scales that transcend individual tactical encounters. When it focuses attention on the Spanish brigantines, López de Ayala experiences the psychological pressure of being evaluated by consciousness that operates according to temporal perspectives measured in centuries rather than campaign seasons. Feathered crests along the creature's neck and spine display coloration that shifts in patterns corresponding to no natural animal behavior known to European natural philosophy. The plumage creates visual effects that interfere with Spanish depth perception while generating acoustic phenomena that resonate through the wooden hulls of both vessels. Spanish soldiers report hearing voices speaking in languages that predate their arrival in the New World, conversations that seem to originate from within the ship's timber rather than from external sources. The Tlaxcalan warriors aboard both brigantines abandon all pretense of alliance with Spanish tactical objectives. These indigenous fighters, who have maintained loyalty to Cortés throughout months of siege warfare, now direct their weapons toward their former allies while chanting in voices that no longer sound entirely human. Their transformation appears gradual yet inexorable, as though proximity to the lake's guardian entity activates obligations that supersede recent political arrangements. Father Mercado attempts emergency exorcism procedures designed for confronting demonic manifestations, but discovers that his ecclesiastical authority encounters active opposition from spiritual forces that operate according to theological frameworks outside Christian doctrine. His holy water, when sprinkled toward the creature, transforms in midair into droplets of liquid obsidian that strike the water surface with metallic percussion. The cross worn around his neck becomes too hot to touch while emitting light that interferes with his vision rather than providing divine protection. Lopez de Ayala maintains tactical discipline despite encountering combat conditions that exist beyond any military training provided by Spanish war colleges. He orders his arquebusiers to concentrate fire on what appears to be the creature's most vulnerable anatomical sections, yet discovers that conventional targeting principles do not apply to adversaries whose physical form exists partially in dimensions that Spanish weapons cannot affect. Matchlock firearms discharge their loads with perfect mechanical function, yet the lead balls pass through sections of the creature that appear solid to visual observation. The entity communicates through methods that bypass normal auditory processing, projecting concepts directly into Spanish consciousness using techniques that predate European arrival in the Americas by millennia. Lopez de Ayala receives tactical intelligence about his own force composition, strategic objectives, and planned extraction routes delivered in perfect Castilian, despite the impossibility of the creature having learned European languages through conventional means. This information transfer includes details about Spanish siege operations that should be classified at command levels far above Lopez de Ayala's security clearance. Water temperature around both brigantines rises to levels that threaten structural integrity of wooden hulls while generating steam that carries scents of copal incense and burning jade, aromatic signatures associated with Aztec religious ceremonies rather than natural thermal phenomena. Spanish soldiers begin experiencing visual hallucinations that present tactical scenarios from their previous military campaigns overlaid with imagery drawn from indigenous mythology, creating psychological disorientation that compromises their ability to distinguish between current threats and recalled experiences. The creature's movement through the water generates currents that propel both Spanish vessels towards shoreline positions that Lopez de Ayala recognizes as tactically disadvantageous for extraction operations. His attempts to maintain control over navigation encounter resistance from environmental forces that appear to possess strategic intelligence about Spanish operational requirements. The lake itself becomes an active participant in combat operations, using hydrodynamic principles to manipulate Spanish positioning according to tactical priorities that favor indigenous defensive objectives. Aztec warriors along the residential district shoreline begin displaying coordinated behaviors that suggest their individual actions serve as components of larger strategic patterns directed by the lake's guardian entity. Their military formations create geometric arrangements that channel spiritual energies while maintaining effective fields of fire against Spanish positions, demonstrating integration between ceremonial obligations and conventional battlefield tactics that European military doctrine has no precedent for countering. Lopez de Ayala's chronometer, when consulted during a brief lull in supernatural phenomena, indicates that the entire confrontation has lasted approximately 4 minutes according to mechanical time measurement. Yet the sun's position suggests that several hours have elapsed since initial enemy contact, creating temporal paradoxes that challenge fundamental Spanish assumptions about the nature of sequential experience during combat operations. As the creature's full length becomes visible above the lake's surface, Lopez de Ayala realizes that his expedition has encountered not merely an unusually large aquatic predator, but a manifestation of indigenous spiritual authority that has been awakened by 3 months of European siege warfare against the sacred geography of the Aztec capital. The mathematical precision of Spanish military engineering encounters forces that operate according to principles that predate European arrival in the Americas by thousands of years. The night serpent of Aztec prophecy positions itself between the Spanish brigantines and their planned extraction routes while the waters of Lake Texcoco begin to glow with bioluminescent patterns that spell out warnings in Nahuatl script visible from space. López de Ayala's tactical report, submitted to Cristobal de Olid 6 hours after his return to Spanish lines, contains gaps in operational narrative that resist conventional military documentation procedures. The captain's account describes successful withdrawal from enemy contact through methods that his own strategic training suggests should have been impossible given the tactical situation at moment of disengagement. Yet physical evidence supports his claims. Both brigantines returned intact with minimal casualties, their hulls bearing scorch marks from exposure to temperatures that should have resulted in complete structural failure. Of the 54 Spanish soldiers who participated in the morning reconnaissance, 47 returned to base camp displaying symptoms that Spanish medical doctrine has no established treatment protocols for addressing. These men show no physical wounds consistent with conventional weapons trauma, yet exhibit behavioral modifications that suggest exposure to psychological warfare techniques unknown to European military science. Several veterans of Italian campaigns, soldiers whose battlefield discipline has been tested across multiple continental conflicts, now refuse to approach Lake Texcoco's shoreline after sunset, claiming auditory phenomena that interfere with their ability to distinguish between current orders and recalled combat experiences. The indigenous allies present more complex assessment challenges. Approximately 300 Tlaxcalan and Texcoco warriors who accompanied the morning operation returned to Spanish lines, yet their political reliability has been fundamentally compromised through exposure to spiritual obligations that supersede their alliance agreements with Cortés. These fighters maintain professional competence in conventional military operations while demonstrating divided loyalties that manifest through subtle behavioral changes. Reluctance to engage in direct action against Tenochtitlan's defenders, increased participation in pre-Christian ceremonial activities, and communication with enemy forces through methods that Spanish counterintelligence cannot effectively monitor. Master Gunner Vázquez files equipment reports that document weapon malfunctions, following patterns that suggest systematic sabotage rather than normal mechanical failure. His bronze falconet, inspected by Spanish artillery specialists immediately upon return to base camp, shows internal modifications that require metallurgical techniques unavailable to any known indigenous technology. The cannon's bore contains crystalline deposits that create acoustic resonance when exposed to specific thermal conditions, transforming the weapon into a musical instrument capable of producing tones that correspond to frequencies used in Aztec religious ceremonies. The expedition's religious component encounters the most severe operational consequences. Father Mercado, examined by Spanish chaplains trained in identifying supernatural influence on Catholic personnel, displays theological modifications that challenge ecclesiastical authority structures established through centuries of church doctrine. His prayers now incorporate linguistic elements drawn from indigenous spiritual traditions while maintaining Orthodox Catholic content, creating hybrid ceremonial practices that Vatican protocols have no framework for evaluating. His crosses and religious medallions show physical alterations, surface etchings that blend Christian iconography with pre-Columbian symbolic systems that appear to have occurred through exposure to environmental conditions that affect sacred objects according to principles outside normal physics. Spanish engineering units tasked with analyzing water samples collected during the morning operation report chemical compositions that contradict fundamental assumptions about Lake Texcoco's hydrological characteristics. Laboratory analysis reveals mineral content consistent with deep ocean environments despite the lake's documented freshwater status, while temperature measurements indicate thermal stratification that requires underground connections to geothermal sources that do not appear on any geological surveys of the Valley of Mexico. More disturbing are the organic compounds that suggest the presence of marine life forms adapted to pressure conditions that should not exist at this elevation. López de Ayala's personal equipment shows modifications that he cannot account for through normal operational procedures. His compass now points toward magnetic orientations that correspond to astronomical phenomena rather than terrestrial magnetic north, while his mechanical timepiece displays additional dial faces showing lunar phases and ceremonial calendar calculations that require mathematical knowledge he does not possess. His Toledo steel sword bears edge modifications that create different acoustic signatures when drawn from its scabbard, producing tonal variations that indigenous allies recognize as components of traditional war chants. The tactical intelligence gathered during the morning reconnaissance proved simultaneously valuable and disturbing to Spanish strategic planning. López de Ayala's observations confirm that Tenochtitlan's defensive capabilities extend beyond conventional military engineering to include spiritual warfare techniques that operate according to principles that challenge European assumptions about the nature of conflict itself. The city's defenders appear to possess communication methods that transcend normal geographic limitations while maintaining coordination with supernatural entities that function as active participants in siege operations rather than passive environmental factors. Casualty assessment reveals patterns that contradict Spanish medical understanding of combat trauma. The 7 soldiers who did not return to base camp left no physical evidence of their fate, no blood, no equipment, no remains that would indicate conventional battlefield casualties. Yet their absence creates psychological effects on surviving unit members that suggest the missing men continue to exist in some form that affects morale through mechanisms that military discipline cannot adequately address. Spanish survivors report dreams that feature their missing comrades, providing tactical intelligence about enemy capabilities while warning against continued operations in Lake Texcoco's spiritual geography. Cristobal de Olid's strategic analysis, forwarded to Cortes through encrypted communication channels, recommends suspension of naval operations against Tenochtitlan's eastern approaches until Spanish forces develop countermeasures for supernatural warfare techniques that existing military doctrine has no established procedures for confronting. His assessment acknowledges that conventional siege tactics, while effective against the city's physical fortifications, prove inadequate when applied to adversaries who integrate religious obligations with defensive strategies according to principles that predate European arrival in the Americas by centuries. The afternoon sun casts shadows across the Coyoacán base camp that Spanish soldiers note with increasing unease. These shadows appear to move independently of their source objects while forming geometric patterns that correspond to architectural motifs visible throughout Tenochtitlan's temple complexes. Spanish sentries report that routine perimeter security becomes increasingly difficult as daylight fades, not due to reduced visibility, but because the approaching darkness seems to carry awareness that evaluates Spanish defensive preparations according to criteria that transcend normal tactical assessment. As evening approaches Lake Texcoco, Spanish forces prepare for nightfall with the knowledge that their siege of Tenochtitlan has awakened guardians that understand warfare as spiritual obligation rather than political necessity. The mathematical certainty of European military engineering encounters forces that operate according to principles measured in cosmological cycles rather than campaign seasons. López de Ayala reviews his mission report one final time before sealing it in official correspondence pouches, knowing that his account documents the first confirmed contact between Spanish steel and the spiritual authority that has protected the Aztec capital since its founding. The night serpent returns to depths that Spanish instruments cannot measure, yet its presence transforms Lake Texcoco into contested territory where the laws of physics themselves serve indigenous strategic objectives. Three months after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Carlos V receives López de Ayala's complete tactical report through diplomatic channels that bypass normal colonial administrative procedures. The document arrives in Seville, bearing wax seals, impressed with symbols that do not correspond to any registered Spanish heraldic designs. their geometric patterns matching architectural motifs that royal scribes cannot identify through consultation with established European artistic traditions. The parchment itself displays preservation characteristics that suggest aging processes inconsistent with transatlantic shipping conditions during summer months. Royal theologians, consulted to evaluate the report's supernatural claims, recommend immediate suppression of all documentation related to indigenous spiritual warfare capabilities encountered during the conquest of Mexico. Their assessment concludes that public knowledge of successful indigenous resistance to Christian military authority could undermine Habsburg legitimacy throughout Spanish colonial territories, while providing theological ammunition for Protestant reformers seeking to challenge Catholic doctrinal supremacy. The Night Serpent incident receives classification under ecclesiastical protocols typically reserved for documented cases of demonic intervention in European political affairs. Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, despite his death 4 years prior to the conquest, somehow provides posthumous commentary on López de Ayala's report through documents discovered in sealed chambers beneath the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes in Toledo. These papers, written in the cardinal's authenticated handwriting, describe defensive spiritual techniques that pre-Christian populations throughout Europe employed against Roman expansion, suggesting that indigenous supernatural resistance represents recurring patterns of cultural survival rather than isolated phenomena specific to American territories. The official historical record undergoes systematic revision through procedures that remove all references to supernatural encounters during siege operations at Tenochtitlán. Cortés' letters to the Spanish crown, previously filed in royal archives with complete tactical details, now contain edited versions that attribute unusual battlefield phenomena to psychological effects of altitude sickness and tropical disease rather than authentic supernatural intervention. Spanish military doctrine incorporates new regulations prohibiting discussion of spiritual warfare techniques encountered during colonial operations, creating classification protocols that persist through subsequent centuries of imperial expansion. López de Ayala himself disappears from historical documentation approximately 6 months after submitting his reconnaissance report. Royal pension records show continued payments to his designated beneficiaries through 1547, yet no contemporary sources document his physical presence at any Spanish location after the winter of 1521. His tactical expertise, demonstrated through successful completion of hazardous reconnaissance operations, would normally have ensured continued military promotion and geographic assignments that generate abundant historical evidence. Instead, his career terminates with administrative completeness that suggests deliberate erasure rather than natural conclusion. The indigenous allies who survived the morning encounter with the Night Serpent integrate their experiences into oral traditions that preserve tactical intelligence about European vulnerabilities for transmission to future generations. Tlaxcalan historians, working within cultural frameworks that treat supernatural events as normal components of political reality, develop narrative structures that maintain operational details while embedding them in mythological contexts that protect sensitive information from Spanish colonial surveillance. These accounts describe the lake's guardian as responding to ritual obligations rather than military necessity, suggesting that indigenous resistance capabilities remain available for activation under appropriate ceremonial conditions. Archaeological evidence from the Valley of Mexico supports claims that Lake Texcoco's spiritual geography predates Aztec political control by several centuries. Spanish colonial administrators, tasked with establishing Catholic religious authority over indigenous sacred sites, report construction challenges at locations where pre-Columbian temples show foundation work that extends below current lake levels. Engineering surveys reveal architectural elements that require stone-cutting techniques unavailable to known indigenous technology, while astronomical alignments correspond to celestial phenomena with mathematical precision that Spanish scholars cannot replicate using contemporary European computational methods. The Codex Xochimilco, compiled by indigenous scribes working under Spanish colonial supervision, contains pictographic sequences that depict events corresponding to López de Ayala's tactical timeline while presenting supernatural encounters as routine components of Aztec defensive strategy. Spanish censors, lacking expertise in Nahuatl pictographic writing systems, approved these documents for colonial administrative purposes without recognizing that they preserve detailed intelligence about European military vulnerabilities for use by future resistance movements. The Codex describes the Night Serpent as one of several guardian entities that maintain protective obligations throughout the Valley of Mexico, according to ceremonial calendars that continue operating despite political conquest. Father Mercado's theological modifications, documented through ecclesiastical investigation procedures, result in his transfer to monastery duties in remote Spanish territories where his hybrid ceremonial practices cannot influence colonial religious policy. His personal effects, examined by Inquisition specialists trained in identifying supernatural contamination of Catholic personnel, contain religious artifacts that display physical properties inconsistent with normal sacred object characteristics. His prayer books show text variations that appear and disappear according to lunar cycles, while his crosses generate acoustic phenomena that interfere with traditional Latin liturgical procedures. Spanish military engineering units assigned to drainage projects in the Valley of Mexico encounter recurring technical difficulties that suggest active opposition from environmental forces that resist European modification of indigenous hydraulic systems. Lake Texcoco's water levels fluctuate according to patterns that contradict seasonal precipitation data while maintaining depths that preserve underwater architectural elements from pre-Columbian construction periods. Spanish attempts to alter the lake's geographic configuration encounter engineering obstacles that appear to result from deliberate sabotage rather than normal geological resistance to human modification. The suppression protocols established for the López de Ayala incident create precedents that influence Spanish colonial policy throughout the Americas. Subsequent military encounters with indigenous supernatural resistance capabilities receive similar classification treatment, creating historical gaps in official documentation that persist through centuries of imperial administration. Royal archivists develop specialized storage procedures for documents containing supernatural content, establishing secure facilities that maintain restricted access through ecclesiastical rather than secular authority structures. Modern archaeological investigation of Lake Texcoco's drained bed reveals construction elements that correspond to descriptions contained in classified Spanish colonial documents. Sonar surveys detect structural anomalies at depths that suggest continuous architectural development over periods extending far beyond documented pre-Columbian chronology. Water temperature measurements continue to show thermal stratification that requires underground connections to geothermal sources that do not appear on contemporary geological surveys of the Valley of Mexico. The Night Serpent incident establishes indigenous supernatural warfare as a classified threat category that influences Spanish colonial military doctrine throughout subsequent centuries of imperial expansion. Administrative protocols developed for suppressing documentation of the encounter create institutional frameworks that persist long after the specific tactical situations that originally justified their implementation. The guardian entities of Lake Texcoco maintain protective obligations that transcend political conquest while awaiting ceremonial conditions that might once again require their intervention in defense of sacred geography that Europeans continue to misunderstand as mere real estate. In sealed chambers beneath Spanish colonial archives, López de Ayala's complete report preserves tactical intelligence about the morning when European military science encountered forces that operate according to principles older than conquest itself, their presence transforming Lake Texcoco into contested territory where the mathematics of siege warfare meet the fluid geometry of myth, legend, and spiritual obligation that measures time in cosmological cycles rather than campaign seasons.